What if the World Cup you watch every 4 years isn't really about football at all? What if the trophy, the stadiums, the anthems, and the tears of joy are just the surface of something much darker underneath? Before we go any further, do me one favor. Hit that like button right now, not because I'm asking nicely, but because this video took weeks of digging through court documents, investigations, and reports that most people never read. If even one fact in here shocks you, smash subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because this story only gets heavier from here. Let's start simple. The World Cup is the single most watched event on Earth. Over 5 billion people tune in. Bigger than the Olympics, bigger than the Super Bowl, bigger than any single religious gathering broadcast on television. It is, without exaggeration, the closest thing humanity has to a shared global moment, and that is exactly why it became a target. Not a target for hackers or terrorists. A target for something far quieter and far more dangerous. Governments and billionaires who realize that owning this tournament means owning a piece of the world's attention. And when you control the world's attention, you control something far more valuable than money. You control image. You control reputation. You control how billions of people see your country, even if the reality on the ground looks nothing like what's on screen. To understand how we got here, we need to understand the organization that hands out this golden ticket. FIFA. FIFA stands for the Fédération Internationale de Football Association. It was created back in 1904 in a small room in Paris by a handful of men who just wanted to organize international football matches. Innocent enough. Today, FIFA is headquartered in a quiet, expensive building in Zurich, Switzerland, and it is registered as a non-profit organization. Read that again, a non-profit. A non-profit that pulls in billions of dollars every 4-year cycle from broadcasting rights, sponsorships, and ticket sales. A nonprofit whose former president lived a lifestyle that most CEOs of actual profit-driven companies would envy. A nonprofit with no shareholders to report to, no public board demanding transparency, and a voting system that looks democratic on paper but works very differently in practice. Here's the part that surprises most people. FIFA has 211 member countries. That's more than the United Nations. Every single one of those countries, no matter how big or small, gets exactly one vote when it comes to deciding who hosts the World Cup. Sounds fair, right? One country, one vote. Pure democracy, except it isn't. Think about it this way. A tiny island nation with 50,000 people has the exact same voting power as a country with 200 million people and a footballing culture stretching back over a century. That means the deciding votes for the world's biggest sporting event don't necessarily come from football powerhouses. They come from small, often under-resourced federations, many of which rely heavily on funding and grants that FIFA itself distributes. Now ask yourself a question. If you were a billionaire or a government trying to win hosting rights, and you knew that the votes that actually mattered belonged to small federations who badly needed money, what would you do? You'd find a way to make sure that money found its way to the right people, at the right time, just before a vote. And according to investigators, courts, and journalists across multiple countries, that is exactly what happened, again and again. In May of 2015, something happened that shook the world of football to its core. Swiss police, working alongside the United States Department of Justice, raided a luxury hotel in Zurich. They weren't there for a robbery. They were there to arrest senior FIFA officials, some of them in their pajamas, just hours before FIFA's presidential election was set to begin. The American indictment that followed wasn't a few pages of vague accusations. It ran for over 150 pages. It described more than 2 decades of organized corruption, bribery, wire fraud, money laundering, officials taking payments in exchange for broadcasting deals, sponsorship contracts, and yes, World Cup hosting votes. Investigators estimated more than $150 million in illegal payments moved through the system over the years. The man at the top of FIFA at the time was Sepp Blatter. He had run the organization for nearly 2 decades. Despite the scandal exploding around him just days before the election, he still won. 4 days later, under unbearable global pressure, he resigned. But here's the question that should bother you. If the corruption was this deep, this organized, and this long-running, how did 2 of the most controversial World Cup hosting decisions in history happen in a single afternoon? Because that's exactly what occurred in December 2010. On that one day, FIFA's executive committee decided 2 World Cups at once. The 2018 tournament went to Russia. The 2022 tournament went to Qatar. Let's talk about England first, because their story tells you everything about how this system really works. England's bid for the 2018 World Cup had nearly everything going for it. World-class stadiums already built, deep football history, massive fan culture. Independent analysts ranked it as one of the strongest technical bids in the entire race. England received 2 votes out of 22. Just days before that vote, a major British news investigation aired allegations against several FIFA officials, accusing them of accepting bribes in exchange for their support. FIFA's response wasn't to investigate the accused officials. FIFA's response was to threaten England with exclusion from the tournament for embarrassing the organization. Sit with that for a second. The accusers got punished more aggressively than the accused. Russia won the 2018 hosting rights instead, a country that had annexed Crimea from Ukraine just 4 years later, violating international law in the process. A country repeatedly accused of interfering in foreign elections. A country where journalists investigating the government had an alarming habit of dying under mysterious circumstances. And in 2018, the world watched Vladimir Putin sit in the stands of the World Cup final, smiling as France lifted the trophy in a stadium his government had built specifically to project an image of strength, stability, and global respectability. For 1 month, the world's cameras showed a Russia of beautiful stadiums, passionate fans, and incredible football. The other Russia, the one human rights organizations had been warning about for years, simply wasn't part of the broadcast. Now let's go to the story that changed everything: Qatar. Qatar is a small country in the Persian Gulf. You could fit it inside many American states with room to spare. Its population is under 3 million people. Before 2010, it had almost no global footballing history. Summer temperatures regularly soar past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to make outdoor football dangerous, sometimes deadly. It had no major stadiums built, no transport infrastructure ready for a tournament of this size. And yet, in December 2010, Qatar won the right to host the 2022 World Cup. The man who led Qatar's bidding campaign was a billionaire named Mohammed bin Hammam, who also happened to sit on FIFA's executive committee at the time. Years later, he was banned from football for life after investigators found he had paid cash to officials in the Caribbean in exchange for support during his own campaign to become FIFA president. He denied any wrongdoing connected to Qatar's World Cup bid specifically. The investigation into whether similar tactics secured Qatar's hosting rights was eventually closed, with no public conclusion that satisfied independent observers. So why did Qatar want this so badly that it was willing to spend such enormous resources chasing it? Because this was never really about football. It was about survival and status in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods on earth. Qatar sits sandwiched between 2 regional giants, Saudi Arabia and Iran, both of which have, at different points, treated Qatar with suspicion, bordering on hostility. Qatar has faced blockades from its own neighbors. It has been accused of funding groups its neighbors consider dangerous. In a region defined by shifting alliances and constant tension, a small country with massive natural gas wealth needed something that pure money couldn't buy: international legitimacy. And nothing on earth grants instant global legitimacy quite like hosting the World Cup. This is what political analysts call soft power. Instead of using military force or economic pressure to gain influence, a country uses culture, spectacle, and global attention to reshape how the world perceives it. Qatar already owned a famous European football club. It already controlled a massive sports broadcasting network across the Middle East. The World Cup was simply the crown jewel in a much bigger strategy. And here is where the story turns from political maneuvering into something far more tragic. To build the stadiums, the hotels, the roads, and the entire infrastructure needed to host a World Cup from almost nothing, Qatar relied on an enormous workforce of migrant laborers. Men from Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines left their homes and families, hoping to earn enough money to support the people they loved. In 2021, a major newspaper investigation estimated that more than 6,500 migrant workers died in Qatar in the years between winning the bid and the tournament actually taking place. Heat exhaustion, cardiac arrest. Causes officially listed simply as natural, even for men in their 20s and 30s working outdoors in extreme heat. Qatari officials disputed those numbers. FIFA disputed those numbers too. But human rights organizations had been documenting troubling labor conditions in the Gulf for years before the World Cup even became a factor. Workers often had their passports confiscated by employers the moment they arrived, a practice recognized internationally as a warning sign of forced labor. Many were housed in cramped labor camps with poor sanitation. A system called kafala tied a worker's legal right to remain in the country directly to their employer, meaning leaving a bad job or even leaving the country often required an employer's permission. To Qatar's credit, real reforms did eventually happen. In 2020, the country abolished exit visa requirements for most workers. Parts of the kafala system were dismantled. A minimum wage was introduced for the first time. These changes genuinely improved real lives. But they came only after years of global pressure. painful investigative journalism, and the deaths of thousands of human beings who never got to see the stadiums they built actually used. This is the uncomfortable paradox sitting at the heart of this story. The same corrupt process that handed Qatar a World Cup it likely shouldn't have won may have also created the very pressure that forced real labor reforms across the entire Gulf region. Is that a victory? Is it a tragedy? Honestly, it's both at the same time, and that complexity is exactly why this story deserves more than outrage. It deserves understanding. If this is making you see football differently, that's exactly the point of this video. But I need your help too. Drop a comment right now with one word. Which part of this story surprised you the most so far? I genuinely read these, and your comments help me know what to dig into next. Now let's talk about how FIFA actually responded to all of this criticism, because the response tells you almost as much as the corruption itself. During the 2022 tournament, several European national teams planned to have their captains wear rainbow-colored armbands during matches as a quiet show of solidarity with LGBTQ rights, since same-sex relationships are criminalized in Qatar. FIFA threatened those players with sporting penalties if they wore the armbands on the pitch. The teams backed down. Germany's players instead covered their mouths for a pre-match photo, a silent protest against being silenced. Just before the tournament began, FIFA's president, Gianni Infantino, gave a press conference that left journalists in the room visibly stunned. He told the world that as a European with red hair and freckles who had been bullied as a child, he personally understood discrimination, and that the West should therefore stop criticizing Qatar. He went on to say he felt Qatari, felt Arab, felt African, and felt gay, apparently as an attempt to show empathy. What it actually showed was a complete disconnect from the seriousness of the issues being raised. Thousands of families were mourning workers who died building those stadiums, and the head of the organization responsible was talking about his childhood instead. That wasn't a public relations mistake. That was a glimpse into how the people running this sport actually see accountability, as something to be deflected, minimized, or talked around, rather than faced directly. So where does all of this leave us today? Let's fast forward. The 2026 World Cup, expanding to 48 teams across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, is projected to generate over $11 billion in revenue. That number alone tells you what this tournament has truly become. Not simply a sporting event, but a financial empire with a ball rolling somewhere in the background. And then there's 2034. In October 2023, FIFA opened the bidding window for the 2034 World Cup. The deadline for countries to formally express interest came less than 24 hours later. Saudi Arabia was the only country from its entire region to submit interest within that impossibly tight window. In December 2024, FIFA's member federations confirmed Saudi Arabia as the host in a vote held over video conference. Australia, which had been quietly exploring a potential bid, withdrew after concluding that the process clearly wasn't a genuine, open competition. This is the same Saudi Arabia where women weren't legally permitted to drive until 2018. The same Saudi Arabia where journalist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered inside a consulate in Istanbul in 2018, an act that American intelligence agencies concluded was ordered at the highest levels of the Saudi government. The same Saudi Arabia where same-sex relationships can carry the death penalty and where political dissent is often met with imprisonment or worse. Human rights organizations issued urgent warnings. Football journalists wrote pieces filled with frustration and disbelief. And then, largely, the world moved on to the next news cycle. This, right here, is what the slow normalization of corruption actually looks like. It rarely arrives as one shocking collapse that everyone notices. It arrives slowly, one decision at a time, each new controversy making the last one feel slightly less outrageous by comparison, until eventually people stop being shocked altogether. Outrage fatigue sets in, and the fatigue itself becomes the real story, quietly replacing the injustice that caused it in the first place. Before we go further, let's pause for something a little different. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the truth behind the spectacle, not just enjoying the show on the surface. So here's my ask: tap that subscribe button and turn on notifications if you can. I'm building an entire series unpacking the hidden machinery behind the sports and events we all watch, and trust me, football is just the beginning. Now let's zoom out and ask the harder question. Why does this keep happening, tournament after tournament, decade after decade? The honest answer is structural. FIFA's governance system gives enormous voting power to smaller federations, many of which depend heavily on development grants distributed directly by FIFA itself. American prosecutors found that some officials took those very development funds, meant to grow football at the grassroots level in poorer countries, and used them instead to buy houses, cars, and luxury goods for themselves. One regional football official was accused of accepting millions of dollars in bribes over the years before he died awaiting trial. Another, once one of the most powerful men in American football, became an FBI informant, secretly recording fellow officials with a hidden device, all while reportedly maintaining two separate luxury apartments, one for himself and, almost unbelievably, one for his cats. Another resigned from every position the moment he was accused, then publicly argued that his resignation meant the organization no longer had any authority to investigate him at all. It sounds almost too absurd to be real, but it is real, and it is documented in official court filings, not rumors or speculation. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why does the loudest criticism of countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia so often come from Western nations that have their own complicated histories with human rights and migrant labor? The United Kingdom, one of the most vocal critics of Qatar's labor practices, has continued selling weapons to Saudi Arabia throughout its devastating war in Yemen. The United States, home to the very prosecutors who took down FIFA's corruption network, has its own long history of supporting authoritarian governments, whenever doing so served broader strategic interests. This isn't meant to excuse what happened in Qatar or what's now unfolding in Saudi Arabia. The labor conditions, the deaths, and the human rights violations are real, documented, and deeply serious. But genuine moral clarity requires consistency. If we're willing to criticize human rights abuses abroad, we should be equally willing to examine labor exploitation happening closer to home, including construction workers earning poverty wages on World Cup stadiums currently being built in North America for 2026. Corruption was never a problem unique to the developing world. Despite how convenient that narrative might be, corruption is fundamentally a problem of unchecked power, and wherever power concentrates without real accountability attached to it, corruption tends to follow, regardless of geography, regardless of culture, regardless of how wealthy or poor the country in question happens to be. So what would actual reform look like if FIFA ever decided to pursue it seriously? First, genuine financial transparency. Independent external audits, not internal ethics committees controlled by the very organization they're supposed to police. Several former insiders have called for exactly this. It still hasn't happened in any meaningful way. Second, a fairer voting structure. One country, one vote sounds democratic on the surface, but it doesn't reflect actual representation when a nation of 50,000 people carries the same weight as a nation of 200 million. A system balancing population, football development, and regional representation would make votes far harder to simply purchase through development fund payments. Third, real human rights due diligence built into the bidding process itself before hosting rights are awarded, not used afterward as a justification once the world starts asking uncomfortable questions. Fourth, genuine international legal accountability. The American prosecutions were an important first step, but they only succeeded because the corruption happened to pass through American banks, giving the United States legal jurisdiction. A broader international framework for holding global sports organizations accountable, similar to frameworks that already exist for banks and pharmaceutical companies, is long overdue. None of this is simple, none of it will happen overnight, but all of it is genuinely necessary if football wants to remain something people can trust, rather than something people simply tolerate because they love the game too much to look away. And maybe that's the real tragedy hiding underneath all of this. Football is one of the most beautiful, democratic things humans have ever created. It needs nothing more than a ball and a patch of open ground. It doesn't care about your language, your income, or your passport. For 90 minutes, it brings people together in a way almost nothing else on earth manages to do. But somewhere along the way, the people entrusted with protecting that beauty turned it into something else entirely. A tool for laundering reputations, a bargaining chip in geopolitical strategy, a revenue machine generating billions of dollars while the human cost of building that machine gets quietly buried beneath highlight reels and trophy celebrations. Those 6,500 workers who died in Qatar weren't statistics on a spreadsheet. They were fathers, they were sons, they were husbands and brothers who left everything behind, hoping to build a better future for the families waiting back home. They built stadiums so the entire world could watch 22 men chase a ball across a field. And in return, the man leading the organization responsible spoke about being bullied for having red hair. That isn't simply a leadership failure. That's a profound moral failure, one that deserves far more attention attention than a single news cycle and a brief wave of outrage before everyone moves on to the next distraction. So what can actually change this? Look at what happened with the European Super League in 2021, when 12 of the continent's biggest clubs attempted to break away and form their own closed, self-serving competition. The entire plan collapsed within 48 hours, almost entirely because ordinary fans refused to accept it. Not executives, not governments, not sponsors, fans. Regular people who simply love this game refused to let it be stolen from them. That single moment proved something incredibly powerful. The market for football isn't infinite. There are lines that fans, when united, simply will not allow to be crossed. The real question now is whether that same collective power can be sustained and aimed at the slower, far less glamorous work of genuinely reforming FIFA, rather than simply reacting to each new scandal as it surfaces and then quietly forgetting about it weeks later. Because here's the truth this story leaves us with. This isn't a finished chapter we're looking back on from a safe distance. It's still happening, right now, in real time. Workers are currently building stadiums in Saudi Arabia for a tournament that won't even kick off until 2034. Their lives are the real human stakes inside a governance debate that most football fans have genuinely never stopped to think about. You deserve better than simply being handed a beautifully produced broadcast and told to enjoy the show. They deserve better than being an invisible footnote in someone else's geopolitical strategy. And this game, this incredible, imperfect, deeply human game that has given so many of us our happiest memories, deserves leadership that actually values it as more than just a number on a balance sheet. If this video changed how you see the World Cup, even slightly, do one simple thing before you go. Share it with one person who watches football but has never heard this side of the story. Not because a single share fixes a broken system, but because real accountability always starts with awareness. And awareness only spreads when people like you decide it's worth passing on. And before you leave, tell me honestly in the comments, knowing everything you just learned, will you watch the next World Cup the same way you used to? Or has something in how you see this game just quietly, permanently changed?